In just 43 seconds, 7,000 dead Californians and $187 million in failed policy were about to destroy the compassionate progressive image of a governor who chose ideology over lives.
Gavin Newsom didn't expect a father holding his daughter's photograph.
He didn't expect documentation proving nurses watched a teenager die 200 feet from a supervised injection site because policy prohibited intervention.
Cameras captured the exact moment harm reduction became mass casualty.
The committee room watched as compassion and death collided in unbearable testimony.
What did that father reveal about Newsom's fentanyl policies that made even progressive Democrats demand his resignation? February 14, 2025, 10:47 in the morning. California State Senate Public Health Committee hearing room, Sacramento. Valentine's Day carried bitter irony for the families gathered in the gallery, each clutching photographs of children who would never celebrate another holiday.
Governor Gavin Newsom entered with characteristic confidence, his prepared remarks about evidence-based harm reduction and compassionate drug policy ready to defend what he called California's progressive approach to addiction. What he didn't know was that sitting 3 rows back was Michael Torres, holding a photograph of his 19-year-old daughter Sarah, and documentation that would expose the deadliest policy failure in California history. The hearing had been called to examine California's response to the fentanyl crisis. The numbers were staggering and getting worse. 7,143 Californians had died from fentanyl overdoses in 2023. That was more deaths than from car accidents, homicides, and COVID-19 combined. San Francisco alone had lost 806 residents to fentanyl, making it the leading cause of death for adults aged 18 to 49 in the city. But what made these deaths particularly devastating was that many were preventable, and California's policies had actively made the crisis worse. Senator Brian Jones, a Republican from San Diego known for aggressive questioning, had spent 6 months investigating California's fentanyl response. What he discovered would redefine government failure. While overdose deaths skyrocketed, California had spent $187 million on harm reduction programs that provided clean needles, supervised injection sites, and overdose reversal medication but offered 0 mandatory treatment options. Newsom had repeatedly opposed laws requiring treatment for chronic drug users, claiming mandatory intervention violated personal autonomy and progressive values. The morning session began with public health officials presenting statistics about fentanyl's dangers. 2 milligrams could kill. Street drugs were increasingly contaminated. Dealers were targeting younger users. Standard testimony that generated concern but offered no accountability for policy failures. Then Senator Jones began his questioning at 10:47 a.m. He started with a simple chart showing fentanyl deaths over 5 years. The line graph climbed steadily upward like a stock market crash in reverse. 2019, 3,200 deaths. 2020, 4,100. 2021, 5,600. 2022, 6,300. 2023, 7,143. Governor Newsom, Jones began, his voice carrying controlled anger. This chart shows fentanyl deaths have more than doubled under your administration's harm reduction policies. At what point do you acknowledge that your approach is failing? Newsom deployed his standard defense about the complexity of addiction, the need for compassionate approaches, and the importance of meeting drug users where they are rather than forcing treatment. His delivery was smooth, practiced, completely inadequate against what was coming. Governor, let's examine what meeting drug users where they are actually means in practice, Jones said, pulling out a thick binder. California currently operates 23 supervised injection sites where drug users can consume illegal narcotics under medical supervision. These facilities cost taxpayers $187 million over 3 years. Can you tell this committee how many users from these facilities have successfully entered treatment and achieved sobriety? Newsom hesitated. The question targeted the fundamental weakness of harm reduction without mandatory treatment pathways. Senator, the goal of supervised injection sites is to prevent overdose deaths and connect users with services, not to force treatment against their will. Governor, I didn't ask about your philosophy. I asked for numbers. How many people achieved sobriety through these $187 million facilities? Newsom glanced at his health director, searching for cover. Senator, sobriety isn't the only metric of success. Reducing infectious disease transmission, preventing overdose deaths, and maintaining connection with vulnerable populations are all. Governor, the answer is 437,
Jones interrupted, holding up a report.
437 people out of 23,800 users tracked over 3 years.
That's a 1.8% success rate.
We spent $187 million to help 437 people get sober.
That's $427,000 per successful recovery.
The math was devastating. Nearly $500,000 per person who actually got clean while 7,000 died. But here's what's even more troubling. Jones continued, his voice rising. While you were spending $187 million on supervised drug use, you opposed Senate Bill 742, which would have created mandatory treatment programs for chronic users arrested multiple times. That bill would have cost $83 million and was projected to serve 15,000 people annually. You called it criminalization of addiction and threatened to veto it.
The contrast was damning.
Newsom supported spending more money to help fewer people use drugs safely but opposed spending less money to actually treat addiction.
Jones pulled out another document. Governor, this is San Francisco's Medical Examiner report for 2023. 806 fentanyl deaths. Do you know what the leading location for these deaths was? Newsom remained silent, clearly sensing a trap. The Tenderloin District, Jones answered. 412 deaths in a 2-square-mile area.
That same area contains 6 supervised injection sites, dozens of needle exchange programs, and more than 200 outreach workers. The highest concentration of harm reduction services in California, and also the highest death rate.
How do you explain that?
The question exposed the central paradox of harm reduction without treatment.
More services didn't mean fewer deaths when those services enabled continued drug use without providing exit pathways.
Senator, the Tenderloin faces unique challenges related to poverty, mental illness, and Governor, let me introduce you to someone who understands those challenges intimately, Jones interrupted, gesturing to the gallery.
Michael Torres stood slowly.
He was 51 years old, wearing a simple suit, his face showing the kind of grief that permanently ages a parent. In his hands, he held a framed photograph of a young woman with bright eyes and a radiant smile. This was Sarah Torres, and she had been dead for 13 months. Mr. Torres lost his daughter to fentanyl on January 12, 2024, Jones explained. He's here today because the circumstances of her death reveal the fatal flaws in your harm reduction policies.
Mr. Torres, would you like to address Governor Newsom?
Michael Torres walked to the public testimony microphone with the slow, deliberate steps of someone who had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in his mind.
He placed Sarah's photograph on the podium where everyone could see her face.
For several seconds, he simply stood there, gathering strength to speak about the worst day of his life. Then he found his voice.
Governor Newsom, this is my daughter Sarah.
She was 19 years old. She loved art, wanted to be a teacher, and made the worst mistake of her life when she tried fentanyl at a party when she was 17. His voice cracked, but he continued.
For 2 years, we tried everything to help her. Private treatment centers, outpatient therapy, support groups. Nothing worked because she wasn't ready to stop. California's laws said we couldn't force her into treatment because she was an adult and it violated her autonomy.
The phrase violated her autonomy carried bitter irony. Respecting her autonomy had killed her.
On January 11, 2024, Sarah was living on the streets in San Francisco's Tenderloin.
She had been homeless for 4 months. I was trying to convince her to come home, to try treatment again. She said she would think about it. Michael paused, tears streaming down his face. The next morning, January 12, at approximately 6:47 a.m.,
Sarah used fentanyl on the sidewalk at the corner of Hyde and Turk Streets. She collapsed immediately.
She was having a fatal overdose.
He pulled out a map and held it up for the committee to see. A red X marked the location where Sarah died. A blue circle 200 feet away marked something else. This blue circle, Governor, is the Tenderloin Linkage Center, one of your supervised injection sites. It's staffed 24 hours a day with nurses and outreach workers trained in overdose response. It's stocked with Narcan. It has immediate access to emergency medical services.
Michael's voice grew stronger, powered by anger breaking through grief.
Sarah died 200 feet from that facility.
Nurses were inside. They saw her collapse. Security camera footage shows they watched her die for 8 minutes before calling 911. The revelation sent shock waves through the chamber.
Nurses watched a teenager die? I obtained the security footage through a public records request, Michael continued, pulling out a tablet. Governor Newsom, I'm going to play 43 seconds of that footage for this committee. He pressed play and the room fell into absolute silence.
The video showed a street corner from an elevated angle. A young woman sat against a wall, clearly using drugs. She slumped over.
Seconds passed. A full minute.
Through a window visible in the frame, figures could be seen inside the supervised injection facility, but no one emerged to help.
2 minutes. 3 minutes. The girl wasn't moving. Still no response from the facility 200 feet away. At the 8-minute mark, finally, someone emerged and approached. But by then, Sarah Torres was dead. When the video ended, several committee members were crying. Even Newsom looked shaken.
8 minutes, Michael said, his voice barely controlled. Your nurses watched my daughter die for 8 minutes.
Do you know why they didn't help her immediately? Newsom opened his mouth but no words came.
Because your policy says supervised injection sites can only provide services to people inside the facility, Michael answered.
Sarah was on the sidewalk.
That's outside their jurisdiction. So they watched a 19-year-old girl die 200 feet away because helping her would violate the facility's operating procedures.
The bureaucratic absurdity of the policy was suffocating.
Nurses trained in overdose response watched someone die because she was on the wrong side of a property line. Governor Newsom, you spent $187 million on facilities that watched my daughter die, Michael continued, his anger now fully surfacing. You opposed mandatory treatment that might have saved her life. You called forcing addicts into treatment criminalization while 7,000 Californians died.
He held up Sarah's photograph. Look at her face, Governor.
She was 19 years old. She had her whole life ahead of her. And she died on a sidewalk 200 feet from nurses who were trained to save her but didn't because your harm reduction policy valued procedure over life.
43 seconds of video testimony.
That's all it took. 43 seconds showing a girl dying while nurses watched from 200 feet away, paralyzed by policy that prioritized process over saving lives. Senator Jones seized the moment.
Governor Newsom, Mr. Torres's tragedy isn't unique.
Our investigation found 37 similar cases where overdose victims died near supervised injection sites while staff didn't intervene because victims were outside facility boundaries.
37 preventable deaths because your policies created jurisdictional restrictions on life-saving intervention. He pulled out another document.
But it gets worse.
This is the Tenderloin Linkage Center's annual report.
Last year, they administered Narcan to reverse overdoses 1,247 times.
That's impressive. But here's what the report doesn't say. How many of those same individuals died later because they were revived but never entered treatment? The question exposed harm reduction's fundamental flaw.
Saving someone from today's overdose meant nothing if they died from tomorrow's. Governor, we tracked 100 users who were revived multiple times at supervised injection sites.
63 of them are now dead.
We saved them 5, 8, 12 times, then they died anyway because we never required them to get treatment.
We just kept reviving them until we couldn't anymore. The grim arithmetic of harm reduction without mandatory treatment couldn't be argued away. Saving lives temporarily wasn't enough when the underlying addiction remained untreated. Newsom attempted to respond.
Senator, forcing people into treatment against their will has poor success rates and violates. Governor, my daughter's success rate is 0 because she's dead, Michael Torres interrupted with devastating finality.
You can't violate the autonomy of a corpse.
Your compassion killed her. The bluntness silenced the chamber. This wasn't a political opponent attacking Newsom. This was a grieving father stating an unbearable truth. Senator Jones pulled out one final piece of evidence. Governor, let me read you something from Portugal's drug policy framework. Portugal decriminalized drugs in 2001, which harm reduction advocates frequently cite as a model. But here's what they leave out. Portugal's policy includes mandatory appearance before dissuasion commissions that can require treatment.
It's not optional. Users either enter treatment or face sanctions.
He held up Portugal's outcome statistics.
Since implementing mandatory treatment pathways, Portugal reduced drug deaths by 75%. Meanwhile, California's harm reduction without mandatory treatment has increased deaths by 123%. The difference isn't decriminalization. It's whether you actually require people to get help. The comparison destroyed Newsom's entire policy framework. The model he claimed to follow actually included the mandatory treatment component he opposed.
Governor, California has 7,143 reasons to change course, Jones said, his voice carrying moral authority.
Each one of those deaths represents a policy failure.
Each one represents someone who needed mandatory intervention but received optional services instead.
How many more Californians have to die before you admit harm reduction without treatment isn't working?
Newsom had no answer that wouldn't sound callous in the face of Michael Torres's testimony and 7,000 dead Californians. The hearing concluded 90 minutes later, but the damage was complete and irreversible. By that evening, the 43 seconds of video showing Sarah Torres dying while nurses watched from 200 feet away had been viewed 137 million times. The image of Michael Torres holding his daughter's photograph while describing policy-enabled death became the defining symbol of harm reduction failure. Within 72 hours, 5 Democratic state senators who had supported Newsom's policies announced they were reversing their positions and would support mandatory treatment legislation. San Francisco's mayor called for immediate review of supervised injection site protocols, and 12 more parents came forward with similar stories of children who died near harm reduction facilities that didn't intervene. The fentanyl crisis exposed the fatal flaw in Newsom's progressive drug policy. Compassion without accountability enabled death. Respecting autonomy meant respecting the right to die on sidewalks. And spending $187 million on supervised drug use while opposing mandatory treatment meant funding failure at scale. 7,143 deaths, 806 in San Francisco alone. Nurses watching from 200 feet away. 43 seconds of video proof. One father's unbearable testimony. And a governor whose ideology prioritized process over survival. Sometimes the most damning evidence isn't complex policy analysis or statistical modeling. Sometimes it's just security footage of a 19-year-old girl dying alone on a sidewalk while trained medical professionals watch from nearby, paralyzed by policy that valued procedural correctness over human life. Michael Torres learned that the hard way. Sarah Torres paid with her life. And Gavin Newsom's political legacy became forever linked to the question no governor should have to answer. Why did you spend millions helping addicts use drugs safely while opposing laws that might have forced them to survive?